Tonight we see Tim Burton go full Tim Burton in Batman Returns.
I've been down here too long. It's time for me to ascend.
From the sewers of Gotham, a new villain emerges.
You didn't invite me, so I crashed!
From the rooftops of Gotham, the perfect enemy comes to life.
I am Catwoman. Hear me roar. Yeah.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so still people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in one of two ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, last week we went over Batman 1966. Now we are returning to 1992, when Batman Returns came out. This is one of the biggest movies of that year. It is, of course, a sequel to Batman. Tim Burton has become a much bigger name at this point, and the marketing of this movie, I remember when I was 7 years old, this felt ubiquitous with everything going on with McDonald's, and so many of the tie-ins, and the video game, and all that stuff. But I know that this is also a movie with a very mixed reaction to it. There are a lot of people out there, critics and fans alike, who really love this movie, and they think this is the realization of Tim Burton's vision as a director, and there are a lot of people who would just as soon put this into the same pile as Batman Forever and Batman Returns, maybe a step above, but not too much. Brian, where do you come down on this movie?
I actually watched this movie in theaters as a kid, but the problem is, as a kid, it doesn't stick in your mind because a lot of this movie's for adults, and a lot of the elements are just stuff that you wouldn't pick up unless you were an adult. So as a kid, a lot of this doesn't stick, and I think that's the problem. I think, for me, when I was watching it, I was so confused, and then I remember watching it again on VHS and TV as a kid, and still being confused by this movie because I just remember certain things and certain elements, but I couldn't remember certain plot points and certain reasonings and certain motivations. All I remember is just Selena Kyle falling out a window, Danny DeVito looking like a penguin and biting some dude's nose, all these kind of dark things. And Christopher Walken is just in there, chopping up the scenery, but is he really necessary? I don't even think he's necessary in the movie as a character. So it's just really kind of hard to follow at times. But, watching it now in my 30s, I appreciate it a lot more. It's definitely for adults, I think. I don't think this movie's for kids at all because it's not for, there's not anything kid-friendly in this movie. There's so many dark elements to it that no wonder as a kid I'm sitting there 4 years old trying to enjoy this movie. Nothing is connecting with me. And then 2 years later I watch Batman Forever, and that sticks a lot with me because I think visually it's easier to enjoy as a kid. So, and I know that's kind of a controversial statement, but Tim Burton doesn't necessarily make kids movies, and I think that's the problem.
Right, and I mean, there are a couple things that I wanted to point out. Max Schreck is very clearly being blackmailed by the Penguin very early on. That is the impetus for that part of the plot. There is a point when Catwoman is literally chopping up stuffed animals, which is very not kid-friendly, and that's something that I don't think you would ever see in a modern-day superhero movie. And there's a reference to poontang, for God's sakes, and I didn't even realize that that's the first time that I had heard that word until I watched it this most recent time Batman Returns is not a movie that I particularly like to revisit because, quite frankly, it's very unpleasant. I'm not a big fan of Danny DeVito's performance in this movie, and a lot of the plot elements don't really stick out. I think that the best version of Tim Burton is when he is under control, so to speak, to an extent. I think that's why the first Batman, although not perfect and very flawed, I think it still works. I think the fact that Danny DeVito has so much, or I'm sorry, the fact that Tim Burton has so much creative control is one of the reasons that this movie falters. And we're going to get into some of the why in just a few minutes, but the original intention of this movie was to be a more direct sequel to the previous Batman. There was a lot more continuity elements. The fragments of the destroyed Batwing were being sold. There were further revelations into the past of the now deceased Jack Napier, and Bruce Wayne would propose to Vicky Vale by the end of the film. However, Tim Burton did not want to make a direct sequel, and as a result, the script was rewritten. A new Gotham City was designed, and there is elements with the Penguin and Catwoman that remained. Their framing of Batman and the Dark Knight's escape via the backlighter. Other elements that also were saved for the third film were the invasion of Wayne Manor and the Batcave. But also, what you do get in this movie is you get a couple lines about Vicky Vale, but she is essentially thrown away very, very quickly. And I think that when considering the script for this, I don't know how I feel about this movie not being a direct sequel, but it just seems to me like if you bring back the same director and you bring back the same star and you bring back some of the same elements, it just seems to me like not observing continuity seems like a bad idea.
I don't know why they say that, but it still feels like a direct sequel to me. Like, it feels like it's just 3 years later, shit changes, relationships change, and we're just kind of looking at a different part of the city. And that's kind of the other thing I'll talk about in the technical aspects, but they filmed a lot in the same little set areas of the Max's building. So I guess they wanted to just emphasize different parts of Gotham City, but I wanted to see more of the elements from, 89 Batman. But again, that was another problem with the 89 Batman, is that they tried to build this city, but only, left it to a couple different sets that they kept repeating over and over. So that's kind of the problem here too as well. But I get that they kind of wanted to show different parts of Gotham City. But to me, this still feels like a direct sequel. I don't know why people feel it's disconnected, because even when I watch it, like, I still feel like this is the same music, the same feeling, all that kind of thing. Once that issue of continuity kind of goes out the window with Batman Forever, that's where I kind of see that issue. But for me, the Tim Burton movies are still connected in a way that makes sense to me.
Fair enough. And in considering some of the other elements, Michael Keaton was alleged to have earned $11 million for reprising his role as the Caped Crusaders. The Warner Brothers executives were very uneasy with this. However, director Tim Burton stated that he personally believed Keaton deserved it, and I would certainly agree with that, even though he's only in the movie for about 25 minutes. Probably an easy $11 million paycheck, and I think, as has been proven, when you are able to cast someone in the role and you find somebody that works and they want to do it, you kind of pay them whatever they want. I think Robert Downey Jr. absolutely deserved to get $50 million per movie at a certain point, because he was a proven box office success. The Marvel movies are very successful, and I think it was the same case here. Batman Returns was always going to make this amount of money because of how big of a hit the 1989 Batman was. And there is something unfortunate at this point. Burgess Meredith, who played the Penguin on Batman 66 and in Batman the Movie, he was asked to play the Penguin's father in the opening of the film. That would instead be played by Paul Rubens. Unfortunately, illness prevented him from being able to do it. That would have been a very nice nod to the past. Danny DeVito was advised by friend Jack Nicholson, aware of his own financial success, as we talked about in the very third episode of this podcast. Jack Nicholson was said to have walked away with about $50 million. I don't think Danny DeVito walked away with $50 million, but he certainly made a pretty penny for his role as the Penguin. At this point, this was a record setter, making $47 million in 3 days. Now if a movie of this kind, of this budget, these budgets have obviously exploded, but a movie that makes $47 million now, that's nothing.
In fact, that's more than what X-Men or Dark Phoenix grossed in 3 days. So, way more in 3 days. So what does that tell you?
It says that Dark Phoenix is a very bad movie, despite what one of the other co-hosts of the Real World podcasts had to say about it. Annette Bening was cast as Catwoman, but was replaced by Michelle Pfeiffer when she became pregnant. I would be very curious to see what Annette Bening's version of Catwoman looks like, but I do think Michelle Pfeiffer was ultimately the right choice. Her salary was a whopping $3 million, which I am very curious to know what Danny DeVito made, because if they didn't make the same thing, then that's pretty ridiculous, because Michelle Pfeiffer is significantly better and plays just as important of a role in the movie, even though the plot aspect of it probably is not nearly as important.
And I think, you've seen that video of Sean Young on that talk show dressed as Catwoman criticizing Tim Burton, and that's been the urban legend that she was supposed to be Catwoman, but I think that was just all bullshit. I think she just wanted to force, that to happen, and that's just kind of like a myth and a rumor that Sean Young was supposed to be Catwoman. That's just, hearsay, innuendo, whatever. She wanted it to happen, and it didn't happen because I think she just went on TV and made a fool of herself. So
that is something that is pretty infamous. Tim Burton actually prefers this Batman film to the first. Michael Keaton, there's some conflicting information. At first, he may have preferred this sequel as if it spoke to him more, and he greatly enjoyed filming. But then, on an appearance on a podcast with Mark Maron, Keaton stated that that he had never watched the completed movie, and he went on to explain that he only took the role because he needed money for a real estate deal, which I find to be utterly fascinating. This is also the second time the Penguin has run for mayor within the context of Batman continuity. As we mentioned, he previously did this on the 1966 Batman series. An actor that we've talked a great deal about, Brian, is Doug Jones. Of course, he played an important part in the Hellboy movies, but he was in this movie as the Thin Clown, and I felt like I had to mention it because Doug Jones has been a very good actor and someone that we've talked about before.
That went completely over my head, but there's some other character actors in this movie that kind of get lost in the background as well. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but that tall dude with the beard, and then I don't know his name, but he's such a character actor and everything. I think
Vincent Schiavelli is his name. He is definitely that guy.
That's him. Was he in Ghost, or am I just miswritten?
He was in Ghost. He's been in a lot of movies. He was in Better Off Dead as a teacher. He's been in a ton of stuff.
That's what I'm thinking of, and yeah, there's some other people in this as well, but also shout out to the person that plays Max Shrek's son. I forget his name offhand, but he is also Zangief from Street Fighter. So
yes, so this is considered by many people again to be the darkest of the four original Batman films, and this is what inspired them to eventually make Batman Forever and Batman and Robin and lighten the tone a little bit. It was lambasted as too grotesque and problematic, but strangely, it is the only one of the four films which does not include a single reference to the murder of Bruce Wayne's parents. And for that, I give the movie credit because I never want to see Bruce Wayne's parents die again.
Like I said, they already talked about it in the first one, so why mention it again? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know why they even bring it up in Batman Forever, and we'll talk about that next week. But yeah, it's been there and done that. It doesn't need to be mentioned, and you move on with it. Batman's got new problems to deal with. That's what I liked about the plot of this movie.
All right, so this is the very first film made in Dolby Digital. That is pretty much one of the standards now, but it's just interesting that they went in this direction. A couple things about Michelle Pfeiffer. She did put that live bird in her mouth. In fact, they had bird puppets on set, but Pfeiffer thought they all looked too fake, so she put a live bird in her mouth. There was also a point when she was asked if she felt nostalgic about putting the catsuit on, and Pfeiffer stated that once filming was over, she never wanted to see the costume again for as long as she lived. And based on seeing her in that costume, I can understand why. That costume does not look comfortable.
Yeah, I think that's pleather. I don't know if that you caught on that too, like that fake leathery shiny shit that just, oh my god, you put that on, you must be sweating and like uncomfortable movement. I get it. Like, I get why she said that, because that suit is not like practical. It's very like sexy and very designed that way, but it's not practical, and it keeps tearing throughout the movie. I don't know if you noticed that as well.
Right, and I think part of that is by design, but they apparently had 60 catsuits made, and she was only able to perform for a limited amount of time. So it's pretty much absurd, and I cannot imagine in 2019 a costume being made that was just so obtrusive like that. Let's get to the categories. When we talk about heroes, this tends to be one of the longer sections because we're talking about main characters, we're talking about protagonists. There is not a lot to talk about here. Batman is on screen in costume for like 12 minutes. You mentioned he's barely in Act 1. He's barely in this movie. The focus is so much on the villains here. He flat out murders people, and then he unmasks at the end, which makes almost no sense. Alfred has very little to do. I think Michael Gough is very good in this role. He is undoubtedly the best part of Batman and Robin by a very wide margin, but he gets so little to do here other than some bantering scenes with Bruce Wayne, including a reference to Vicky Vale being brought in, which is genuinely funny. That interaction that they have is genuinely funny. And I think Michael Keaton is fine in this movie. He's just not in it. He's not the focus of it. And Commissioner Gordon is useless as he is in these first four movies. That is all I have for the protagonist. Am I missing anyone on the protagonist side of things?
No, that's pretty much it. But yeah, you're right. They really just all the focus was on the villains. If you watch the beginning of the movie, you feel like Penguin is the main character, right? Like that's what it feels like every time I watch the beginning of this movie and then follow it throughout. It feels like this is Penguin's movie, and everything around it is just like all the events and the characters are just everything surrounds him, kind of thing. He's the one running for mayor. He's the one that kind of blackmails Shrek at the beginning. He's the one that wants to get Selena Kyle to be his queen by his side when he runs for mayor. Blah blah blah. It just feels like it's his movie. And Batman not being there, it does lack. But that one, I mean, I did mention that he's hardly in the first act. But I think for me that the best shot of the movie is when he's sitting there brooding in the dark and the fucking bat signal goes up and it fucking lights up his house. To me, like that's the best Michael Keaton Batman moment. Like the best. Like I see that scene, I still get like shivers. As a kid, it doesn't really stick out, but as I get older and appreciate that more, like it feels like that's a total, true Batman moment that the film captures perfectly. And for me, like it kind of makes up for it a little bit that he's not as much in the first act. But goddamn, that shot is just so amazing. And like him kind of like being playing the Bruce Wayne role, him pretending to be a certain way, pretending to be Bruce Wayne, the playboy philanthropist or whatever. And then having those interactions with Selena Kyle. I don't know. I just felt like he wasn't there, but it felt like he needed to be more the main character. But at the same time, that money shot was just money. So for me, I'm going to give it a 6, even though it feels like it's really lacking. And then he's making questionable decisions. He blows up a dude. He kills a dude with dynamite. That's clear as day. So I don't know about you, Batman loyalists out there. He's not supposed to kill people, blah, blah, blah. And yet here we are, Batman Returns. He's killing someone, so...
I don't know, I guess the unmasking for me really bothers me because there's almost no reason to do it because it's very clear to Selena Kyle that he is in fact Bruce Wayne, and at that point he is just unmasking for Max Shrek, and I will get to probably my favorite line, even though I don't like the unmasking itself. I think Brian knows the line I'm talking about, but I'm going to do my Christopher Walken impression when we get to the story section, so I'm going to hold off on that. The fact that Batman is barely in this movie is, I think, a major indictment of it, because it's him that's doing the returning, it's not the Penguin. And because of the fact that I'm not necessarily a fan of Danny DeVito in the role, even though Tim Burton is clearly infatuated with the Penguin, and it is his favorite character, since he is the one that gets the major arc, I am giving this a very low score of 4, just because of the lack of focus on Batman, even though this is a Batman movie.
Hey man, I get it, but... Originally, I think my original score was going to be a 5, but I watched that scene, and it's just so awesome. Him sitting there with a bat signal. That's his moment. That's his number one Batman moment to me as for Michael Keaton.
All right, the villains. This is going to be our longest section because, as we mentioned before, Tim Burton loves the villains. And when we talk about Danny DeVito, he is doing his Jack Nicholson impression, and he is hamming it up throughout, almost from the moment that he is first on screen. There's very little subtlety to the character, and... I don't think that the Penguin works with this. The Penguin is not the Joker. The Penguin is not even a literal penguin. He is an aristocrat who happens to be very short and stocky, and he happens to look like a penguin. That is not what this character is in this movie. He's grotesque, and the movie itself does not seem very clear in how it wants us to feel about him? Are we supposed to feel sorry for him that his parents put him and literally sent him down the river? Are we supposed to hate the fact that he bites a guy's nose off? Are we supposed to hate the fact that he is the very exemplification of toxic masculinity in that scene with the Catwoman when he basically insinuates that he deserves to have sex with her because of their alliance? And there are just these moments where it is totally unclear to me how we are supposed to feel about the Penguin. Because ultimately, even though he is kind of sympathetic in the way that he looks and because of what happens to him, there is nothing in this movie that he does is sympathetic. He blackmails people, he manipulates them throughout, he runs for mayor even though he does not like the people of Gotham. Look at what he does to Batman, look at what he does to Catwoman, look at the fact that he tries to literally take children out of their cribs.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but this is the first time I've noticed the whole Moses allegory that I guess Burton was going for, because right off the bat I was like, oh shit, that's Moses going down the river in the beginning of Ten Commandments. It was like almost the same shot, the same way it was looking. And then, at the end of the movie, he tries to take away their firstborn kid. And I was like, oh shit, that's straight from the fucking Bible in the Ten Commandments. That's so, like, the Moses thing going on. I don't know if that was intentional, but when they said first kid or first child, I was like, wow, they're really going for that whole like Bible Moses feel for some reason with Penguin, for some odd reason. But and he's just a villain though. It was so weird. And yeah, I couldn't tell if they wanted us to be sympathetic towards him or whatnot. And I didn't like the fact that he found out his parents were dead already. That was a missed opportunity. He should have been there, you know, confronting his parents, him and Paul Rubens. That would have been a hell of a scene. All that would have been great. But they went a different route for some reason. Yeah, I don't know. I definitely love Burgess Meredith a lot more as Penguin. I like it when Penguin is an aristocrat, smart, not this, like, you know, monster from the depths that was rejected as a child. And I get that. That's like a story that Burton loves to tell. Like, that kind of story. Very Edward Scissorhands type of a story. But in this case, I don't think it works for this movie necessarily. But I can't help but think that, like, Danny DeVito did, like, I know you don't like the performance, but for what he did, I thought he did a good job. Because, like, it felt like, I don't know, it was just like this whole, like, you know, Universal monster kind of feel that I guess kind of worked on me a little bit. But still, I didn't get enough sympathy for him, so that's kind of in the middle.
Whereas I don't like Danny DeVito, I really like Michelle Pfeiffer. She dials it up as Catwoman. I think there is some subtlety to her character. There's a lot more pathos involved. I just think she's much better overall, even though she does not have nearly as much to do. I think she ultimately comes across as being more sympathetic. Of course, she's an incredibly sexy person, totally believable as a love interest and a threat. There are some elements of the dialogue that feel very 1992-ish and even earlier, but I think that's something that you almost have to expect. The costume is unworkable, but Catwoman's personality fits it in a way that I think works. I did find the idea of Selena Kyle not being able to have men in her life to be utterly absurd, because I don't care what Michelle Pfeiffer is wearing, there is no way she doesn't look attractive. I mean, my God, you watch Ant-Man and the Wasp, and you're still thinking that Michelle Pfeiffer is a very attractive woman, even though she's like 25 years older. For me, Christopher Walken is the best villain in this movie as Max Schreck. I know that you want to take him out, but to me, Catwoman is kind of the one, even though I like her performance, she's the one that if you take her out and kind of put her in her own movie, I think it actually works out so much better. Christopher Walken is great in this movie. There were... of course, I'm going to really save this for the story, but just his costumes, the way that he acts, I think he's so good in this movie. They use actual penguins, and I guess they are technically considered to be villains. There is no way in 2019 they're using actual penguins. They would, at this point, just decide to CGI the penguins. I cannot believe that they got this done. Clearly, Tim Burton was at the height of his powers. All the henchmen are very Tim Burton-y and weird. There's way too much time spent on the Penguin's henchmen in this movie. Way too much screen time given to them. They don't even necessarily have a lot of dialogue, but there's just way too much focus on them.
In terms of Michelle Pfeiffer, yeah, I never realized how great she was in this role until that one scene where she meets Bruce Wayne for the first time, and then she sees Max Schreck for the first time since the moment she got thrown out the window by him, and he's like in shock. And that whole tension between all three of them, where each one's got like a different motivation, of what they want in that room at that moment, and then you see Catwoman kind of just take the screen and just take it for both of them and take over. I thought that was incredible. Like, her performance in that scene was just great, and I can't help but think, man, how come I didn't appreciate this role when I was younger? It's because it's not meant for kids. So it's like frustrating to see how great she is, but then you realize that the performance is not really for kids, and the whole concept of this movie is not really for kids. So that's why it kind of went over my head when I was younger. But now I appreciate it a lot more. She's so good in this movie. Christopher Walken's great. Don't get me wrong; he's great in almost everything, despite how bad he is. I love him even in the Bond movie, A View to a Kill, and that's one of the worst Bond movies ever. But I love him in that. I don't know what it is. It's just I feel like him not being like part of the rogues gallery kind of throws me off. Him not being like I don't even think he appears in the Batman the Animated Series, right? Like, he's just one off for this movie, as I recall. So it's just weird that they had...
I believe it was originally supposed to be Harvey Dent, but they took Harvey Dent out of the movie, again, to remove this as being a direct sequel to the first Batman. So a lot of the plot elements, I think, make more sense if it's Harvey Dent. The fact that he wants to remove him as mayor, I think, makes more sense, but that's what they were going for.
Yeah, and I feel like it's so lost. Like, it's great that he's in it, but I just feel like he should not have been in it, because the focus should have just been on Penguin and Catwoman. But what can you do? But he does have some moments, and then, like I mentioned before, his son, Zangief from Street Fighter, so that popped me. But for my score, I'm going to give it a 7. Now, just because I just feel like, as much as I don't like the Max Schreck character, and some of the stuff about Penguin's character is kind of confusing in terms of where you're supposed to sympathize with, but their performances are just great, and these are 3 great actors, and Michelle Pfeiffer, I just totally didn't realize how great she was until I saw this recently again, and man, she's the best part of this movie, I think, in terms of the performances, so credit to her. And, you know, as much as I love Christopher Walken, I just felt like he didn't have to be a part of this movie, but his performance is so good, you can't deny it, so...
Based on the amount of time that is focused on the villains, this should be Pantheon level. This should be either an 8, a 9, or a 10. The fact that it's a 6, for me, is so much because I think they're all over the place. There's literally too many villains. There's too many henchmen. I really wish that this had been pared down and that Catwoman was in her own movie, because I think there was a lot of good stuff between Batman and Catwoman that could have been played out, and you could have given a lot more for Batman to do if you just put the focus on Catwoman, but they insisted on having the Penguin and Max Schreck and Catwoman all in this movie, and it's just too much, and that's why I have a really hard time giving this something higher than a 6. As we transition into talking about the story, basically the prologue is the Penguin getting thrown down the river by his parents, both of whom have connections to Pee-wee's Playhouse. He then captures Max Schreck and blackmails him into being introduced as kind of a son of Gotham. He learns about his parents and runs for mayor. And then there is audio that costs him a shot at being mayor. This is not something that holds up at all, Brian, given our current political climate, which we are not going to get into. But what he says, let's just say, would probably not disqualify him from being able to run for public office in 2019.
Not at all, but I want to point out that they also mentioned this in the movie as like a joke as well. So this movie does take place during Christmas time, therefore it kind of takes place in December, right? Even, I think it was Penguin himself saying, like, you want me to run for mayor? We just had elections last month. Meaning that he would have been on campaign for, 2 years straight? Unless they got him, like...
No, the idea was that they were going to recall or impeach the mayor, and then he would be able to run. So it was like California circa 2003 when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor.
See, that's what I was thinking, like, because they never, I don't think, did they say I guess I didn't hear the name, or the word recall at all, but I know that they referenced, like, yo, it's December, we just had an election, how do you expect to win when they just had the election? So that was kind of confusing as well, but I thought that was, like, a nice little thing, but also, that is an exact plot from the show where Burgess Meredith as Penguin runs for mayor, actually wins, I think, but then something happens and then he loses power, but I thought that was a nice little nod to the show, and kind of connecting the two together.
We do get a great line from Danny DeVito. Again, I'm not a big fan of his performance, but I'm going to let you say the iconic line that gets him disqualified from being the mayor.
I'm going to play the people of Gotham like a harp from hell.
After this works, and that was a very good impression of Danny DeVito, Brian, the Penguin first decides to capture the firstborn, and then once that is thwarted, he decides to just kill everyone in Gotham by having penguins blow up. And this is the last 40 minutes of the movie, and it's a mess. It really is a mess how everything with the Penguin is resolved. Because, again, so much of the focus is on him, and in the end, the last scene with the Penguin, I think they're kind of going for this tragic feeling with him dying and with him spitting up, and it is disgusting. There is no way a child can enjoy that scene. There's nothing that they can get out of it.
That's what I was thinking when I was a kid. I just felt like disgusted and like didn't know if I like should be watching this movie. That's the feeling I was getting at 4 years old. Like I didn't know if I was like the right, if I was supposed to be watching this movie, like if it was an adult movie or not. That's the feeling that I was getting even as a kid. And just the idea that he was going to send actual penguins out to kamikaze themselves, basically, and just, suicide bombing the city with penguins. I mean, that's animal cruelty again. What's up with, like, Batman and, like, all these rogues gallery villains just blowing up animals, just like the 60s show?
I don't know, man, but speaking of animals, we can talk about Selena Kyle. She's very mousy to start things, pun intended. Then she gets pushed out a window, but she doesn't die. The cats save her, and she becomes Catwoman. She makes a costume on her own. I love those kinds of scenes. I thought this one was actually pretty well done. She chops up stuffed animals because it's Tim Burton. And in the end, she decides to threaten Max Shrek. She literally has 9 lives, get it, because she's a cat. It's completely absurd. I love the elements. I love the scenes with her and Bruce because of the conflict and the inherent conflict that exists between Catwoman and Batman, something that was also alluded to in The Dark Knight Rises. There's even a very similar scene in this movie as compared to The Dark Knight Rises. But eventually it is revealed that and they discover who each other is. And Bruce Wayne, of course, unmasks and reveals himself. And Max Shrek is sitting there. And it's the best line in the whole movie, again, because Christopher Walken says, and I'm going to do my Christopher Walken impression now, he says, Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up as Batman? And I heartily laugh every single time I hear that line.
I laugh as well. Just it's so fucking hilarious, and in context, it's just like it's cool. It's so obvious that he's Batman, and he just revealed himself, and you're asking this fucking question. But again, just like the weird little things about the identity of Batman, and it's the little things throughout its history about like, can't you tell it's Batman? Can't you tell? You know what I mean? Isn't it obvious? And then it's so obvious that it's right in people's faces, and they don't even get it, but. I do like that scene where, like, him and Batman and Selena Kyle are dancing at the party, and they, just by talking to each other and doing the mistletoe line, reveal that they know who each other are. That was kind of, like, interesting. And then, eventually, it was kind of foreshadowing, because sometimes a kiss can turn deadly.
Absolutely, as was proven at the end of this movie. And part of what's so interesting about this film is the arc of this movie is the Penguin. The last shot we see is Catwoman staring at the bat signal, clearly indicating a sequel that would be made, and it wouldn't be. Catwoman would never appear in this version of the franchise again. We barely mentioned Batman or Bruce Wayne. He's barely in the movie. He's a side character. He does not really have an arc in this movie. And for that reason, I cannot go higher than a 5. And I feel like a 5 is still being generous.
Yeah, I'm going with a 5 as well. And also the thing is, like, we kind of know what Penguin wants in terms of his motivations as a villain. Max Shrek basically just wants more power, like literally, like, because he owns like a power plant. He wants to build another power plant, even though Gotham has like surplus in power, and he feels like in the future we're gonna run out and blah blah blah. Very, I don't want to mention our current president's name, but it's very much that kind of feeling from him. That's just me. So yeah, I'm gonna give it a 5. And man, I just feel like they could have done so much more if they kind of refocused things, cut some people out. But in the end, it kind of is what it is, and you kind of have to accept it. And the Penguin stuff is kind of frustrating, like I said, because the focus was too much on him, and it felt like it was his movie at times. But we needed more Bruce Wayne.
We absolutely did. I think we needed more Batman too. I mean, you can't have a Batman movie and have there be 12 minutes of screen time. The technical aspects. Tim Burton vomited his full vision on the screen. Some people are going to really like that. Some people are not. I certainly think there are instances where Tim Burton's vision, even though he didn't direct Nightmare Before Christmas, it very clearly works there. I think, again, Tim Burton is at his best when he has just a little bit of restraint, like even a movie like Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice, where you get some of what Tim Burton is known for, but you don't get everything. And the fact that he had so much creative control, he's at the peak of his powers. There are some really cool shots in here. I'm not going to deny that there are not some really cool shots, and there are some iconic ones. You mentioned the one with Bruce Wayne in front of the bat signal when Batman reveals that he can fly. I think that's a really iconic moment. Even some of the scenes with Catwoman and Batman and some of their interactions when Catwoman flips in and says meow and the whole place blows up. I mean, that was a prominent shot in the trailer that I still remember 25 years later. So there's some really cool shots, but I think that this movie is also way too dark, both in the literal sense and in the figurative sense. And I'm not saying that you cannot do a dark superhero movie, but again, like I mentioned with Logan, there has to be context, there has to be character behind it so that you can invest in it. I don't think that there is any possible way that someone can invest in the Penguin's character. On the positive side, I think the best part of this movie is Danny Elfman's score. It's not a carbon copy of Batman. It is very different. There are some of the cues that remind me a lot of Scrooged, another movie that he composed, but I think this is a banger. My technical score is kind of a mixed bag. I came up with a 6 because I think the music really carries a lot of this movie. I think there is just enough good shots in here to make this a positive score.
See, here's where we're going to kind of differentiate again. Like, I am very high on the look. Despite, like, it being way too dark for, for kids and stuff like that. Just, as I said, as I got older, I appreciated it more, and I just loved, like, the idea of, like, capturing its own kind of unique look for this movie and this universe. I love it when a movie does that, creates its own kind of visual style and look. And, of course, they did, and then the first one, they carried it over here, and I felt like they kind of did a little more, Like, whenever I go to Six Flags, or when I used to go to Six Flags when I was younger, and I go to the part where it's like the Batman the Ride, it feels like I'm walking in Batman Returns. Not necessarily Batman 89 or Batman Forever, but it feels like I'm walking in the same world as Batman Returns. And I'm always going to, like, remember that. I'm always going to stick to that. So for me, like, I'm going to give it an 8 because, like you said, the music is just so great in this movie. The look is great. The costumes are great. The only thing is just the plot and the character development. Those are the weak spots. But you can't blame that on, like, the technical aspects of it because the visual is just so good. So I'm going with an 8. I love the score. The costumes, I mean, like I said before, it looks like the Catwoman costume is, like, literally falling apart as the movie goes on, but I guess that's the point. And I know that I'm not too high on, like, action sequences at night, but I feel like with the snow in the background and kind of the way Burton directs things, and it kind of makes things weird kind of looking, but kind of visually interesting to look at the same time, so he kind of pulled that off. The only weaknesses I find are in the plot and the character development, like I said, so 8 for me on the visual.
Right, we definitely differentiated there. I'm going to be very curious to hear your legacy score because I think this is a mixed bag. I think there are a lot of people, again, who love this movie, who think it's, in some cases, even better than the first one. I think there are other people who despise this as much as the Schumacher movie, so your mileage may vary on this. I think this movie, on the positive side for its legacy score, it directly led to the animated series in a lot of ways, was hugely popular film at the time with all kinds of tie-ins. Some parents weren't happy due to the violence and darkness, even though this was a PG-13 movie. There are people that were very unhappy. The fact that this is PG-13 is honestly surprising to me, because this movie is so much darker than any of the recent superhero movies. I would say this movie is even darker than some of the R-rated superhero movies. I think this movie is absolutely darker than the first two Deadpools, for sure. So I have a hard time with this score. I came up with a 6, again, because of the animated series tie-in, because of the fact that it is so successful, and the fact that a lot of people still really like this movie.
Yeah, we're going to get a little controversial again. I have to go with an 8, because I feel there's so many memorable things that came from this movie. A lot of people still remember Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman. People don't necessarily, when they think of Catwoman, I think a lot of people think of Michelle Pfeiffer, not necessarily Anne Hathaway or Halle Berry, obviously not, but if you rank those three, I think still people associate Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman more so, which I think says a lot because, I mean, the gap between Dark Knight Rises and Batman Returns was like almost, 20 years. So I think that speaks a lot to her performance. And I don't know, I feel like people visually remember this movie a lot. They remember that scene at the beginning where you see the bat signal. People remember that, like, this is a Christmas movie. Like, whenever I see, like, Christmas movie lists, I always see this movie pop up every now and again because people forget it's a Christmas movie and blah, blah, blah. But it does kind of have, like, a Christmas kind of feel to it, like you mentioned with the sound cues and the soundtrack, like much of a kind of a Scrooge kind of feeling. And I don't know if it was, like, purposeful or not, but Christopher Walken's hair kind of reminded me of Bill Murray from Scrooge anyway. So I don't know that was, like, subtle or just unintentional or whatever, but people remember this movie a lot. I remember it a lot as a kid, even though, like I said, like, I didn't enjoy it as much as a kid. It's just, like, the things that stuck out for me were, like, those visual things, but it stuck out, you know what I mean? And a lot of people still remember Danny DeVito as Penguin. They, like, associate him as, like, the go-to movie Penguin, because there hasn't been, really, it's just him and Burgess Meredith. And for the movies, not, because, you know, you can have that show Gotham where Oswald Copperpot is, like, a big part of that show. Not necessarily in the movies. So for that, like, Danny DeVito's going to have that, you know, ace in his pocket because people are going to remember him as the movie Penguin. So for me, it's an 8 because it's just so memorable. It was a big part of the 90s, so influential, despite how I feel about the plot and all the aspects of it and it being too dark for kids. But, man, a lot of people, like, use this movie's influence. So you can't deny that.
As I said, there are people who love this movie. Brian very clearly does, and this is going to be another disparity. I think last week it was me who had a few points higher of a score than you, and this time I think you're going to be much higher. I gave this a 27.
See, I gave it a 34 total, but it's just more of, like, the legacy and the visual style and all that kind of thing because if you go to Six Flags, like, a lot of, like, Tim Burton's visual style of Batman is, like, all over the theme park still. So I feel like that's kind of like a lasting thing. So for me, like, despite how I feel about the story and, like, the unnecessary characters or whatever, it still is, like, an iconic movie of the 90s.
The total score of this is a 61, which is 1 point higher than Batman 1966, which makes me a little sad, but I know that is your preference.
Yeah, and I love both, but, like, you know, you can't help but just see, like you mentioned, the McDonald's toys or whatever, and all the toys that came from it, and the visual style, and just a lot of the visual style of the Batman in the 90s comes from Batman Returns. So,
all right, let's get to the burning questions. There are no riddles this time. Is this movie too dark?
Yes, and that's, like I said, the weaknesses of it. They should have reworked it. It would have been more memorable, I think, if they would have reworked it, made it a little more family friendly, and, you know, maybe just, like, changed little penguin things here and there and made them less grotesque.
I agree completely with you. I think this movie is just unnecessarily too dark. And again, I think there is a world where you can make this just a little bit more family friendly. Not just family friendly, but just there's no reason to have the Penguin be this grotesque. It's just, it doesn't work, and it makes the character come off very poorly. And I think there are points when we're supposed to feel sympathetic, but just the look and the behavior of the character makes it way too difficult to feel sympathy with. And somebody could probably even say the same thing to an extent about Catwoman, even though I don't think she's nearly as dark. Would this movie have been better as two, with the Penguin in one and the Catwoman in the other?
I agree. That would have been played out so much better. I would have accepted Max Schreck more if it was just like him. Maybe, I don't know. If it was just him and Penguin, I think him and Penguin work more than him and Selena Kyle, even though Selena Kyle is the one that killed him at the end. But I definitely see it better as two movies, for sure.
Is this the best Christmas superhero movie ever made?
Yes. I don't know. Well, damn, was Shazam in Christmas?
Shazam is technically a Christmas superhero movie. So we've got Shazam, Iron Man 3, and Batman Returns. Those are really the three major contenders.
Well, I know some other people on the real world will obviously say Iron Man 3, but for right now, I'll go Batman Returns, and then kind of like 2 and 3 are Shazam and Iron Man 3.
I really enjoy Shazam, so that's going to be my pick. I think Shazam is significantly better than both Batman Returns and Iron Man 3. as I've stated many times. So that is my choice. Did Michelle Pfeiffer deserve her own Catwoman movie?
See, I don't know if a Catwoman movie works, man, because you need Batman. Like, it doesn't work without Batman, because what's she gonna be like doing? You know what I mean? Like, is she gonna be going out there fighting crime or being the villain? You know what I mean? Like, she needs that counterpart in Batman. And like, I think it's so obvious in the Catwoman solo movie with Halle Berry that it doesn't work without him.
Look, you say that, Brian, but that movie had a lot of problems. Batman not being involved was not one of them.
Well, it would have helped a little bit.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Now, I believe Catwoman is going to be involved in the Birds of Prey movie. How do you feel about that?
That's fine, because I know Birds of Prey, I think they're going to have some Batman tie-ins anyway, but depending on, the current Batman situation, I don't know. But Birds of Prey I am looking forward to, because it's a fresh concept, but I just hope that they don't do it like Suicide Squad, where it's just like, they kind of make themselves the villain.
Yeah, that's certainly what I'm hoping for as well. I do have some hope that it's going to be better. I believe there's a female screenwriter and a female director. For that reason alone, I have a lot more hope. What is Tim Burton's Batman legacy? Because this is the second and last Batman movie that he directed. He is a producer on the next two movies, but has almost no creative influence. So what is his overall legacy?
I think his legacy is just the visual look, and like to me, he created Gotham City, like what we know as Gotham City. Even in the 60s show, Gotham City just looked like Hollywood backlots. You know what I mean? Here, it's a real world brought to life, and he created it.
Which is ironic, because these are also Hollywood backlots.
Yeah, but it just seems like its own world. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like so unique. You know what I mean? That's what I think he's good at, creating these kind of worlds. In Edward Scissorhands, like, that's clearly like its own little suburban bubble world that he created, and I feel like he kind of created Gotham City the way we kind of interpret it. Like, to me, when I think of Gotham City, I think of his Gotham City. So that's just kind of my kind of take on his visual style.
I certainly think it's a positive one in that he got Batman off the ground and he brought this character to life on the big screen with Batman 1989, which is still one of the most rewatchable and important superhero movies of all time. And I think for that reason alone, even if I am not necessarily a fan of Batman Returns, I certainly do have a positive feeling about his influence on this franchise. And Tim Burton, I think when all is said and done, he's going to be a very interesting director to evaluate, because it just feels like he had a certain period of time that was almost relatively too short, and it just feels like he's been chasing Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice and Batman, which are three of his more successful movies. And I know that he's had Ed Wood, which was an Oscar contender. It almost feels like he's still chasing those movies that he made in the late 80s and the early 90s.
I get what you're saying, because Dumbo has that kind of feeling too, especially with Danny DeVito and Michael Keaton being both back in there, teaming up with Burton again. Because even when I watch Dumbo, it feels like he's going for, that Batman Returns kind of feel, you know what I mean? Where he kind of creates this universe and kind of brings you into this world. And that's kind of what he does, so I'm kind of used to that. But to me, like, he created the Gotham City that I know and love and kind of think of in my head. And whenever I went to Six Flags, I just saw buildings and I thought, man, I'm in Batman Returns right now. So that's what I'm going to remember about it.
All right, so that is Batman Returns. And if you think it's going to get better, it's not, as next week we are going to be discussing Batman Forever, and then in 2 weeks we are going to discuss Batman and Robin. So things are going to go downhill for a little bit. I think what we are going to do is, we do have Batman Mask of the Phantasm. We are going to save that as kind of our in-between franchises. We are going to go into the Christopher Nolan trilogy, but we are going to review Mask of the Phantasm before we get to the Nolan trilogy, and I think that just makes more sense, because I really just want to get through Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, because I've been dreading reviewing these two movies for 18 months because of how much I dislike them, and am very much looking forward to reviewing them and watching them again. So let's just rip the Band-Aid off, Brian. That's what we got to do.
Well, I have them on Blu-ray, so the plus side for me is finally watching them in like bright, HD quality. And that'll be the only positive thing, because I love watching old 80s, 90s movies on Blu-ray and being like, wow, this looks so good on Blu-ray. Like, I can't believe we had VHS back in the day that degraded the quality. So that's kind of my feeling.
Certainly that is the case. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to our show this week. We will return next week with Batman Forever.
So, do you think Max Schreck gave his son a watch? He handed down a watch to him, you know what I mean? From, his ass?